actively deal with the challenges that the country faces when it comes to load shedding. The CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, has said load shedding can be solved, and if we all work together, and I agree with him, we all have to work together to address the problem of load shedding, and they are doing as much as they possibly can, dealing with big machines, big equipment that they have to properly streamline to generate the energy that we need. And sometimes these big machines break down, and the people though are committed to making sure that they are repaired, and we just need to enable them. We just need to give them the capacity from our processes, from the funding point of view, and enable them to get the work done as quickly as possible. Because what is important is to put megawatts on the grid. That is our main focus. And a whole lot of other things we will attend to as we move on. But right now, my focus, the minister's focus, even the premier's focus and everybody else's focus is to put megawatts, as many of them on the grid as possible. So that, for instance, here at Tutuka, we should get all the 6 units operating. Right now, we've had 2 operating, another one is coming on stream, and they are going to work very hard to get the other 3 on stream, and they've already got dates that they've put in place to get all the units operating. When this power station functions well, it generates easily 3,500 megawatts or so, and that is what we want to see Tutuka doing. It's one of those power stations that has always worked well. With a whole lot of problems that we have had, including state capture and corruption, Tutuka has been brought down. Now we are going to lift it again, and we are going to make sure that Eskom does rise.
Well, that was President Cyril Ramaphosa on an oversight visit to Tutuka Power Station in Mpumalanga as South Africa continues to endure rolling blackouts. Eskom implemented the latest rounds of rolling blackouts more than 3 weeks ago. Stage 2 power cuts are being implemented this weekend between 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. Now, let's discuss this. We are now joined via Zoom by Hilton Trollip, Independent Consultant in Energy Research. Hilton, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And I'm sure you heard that clip where President Cyril Ramaphosa used the words again, as quickly as possible. I mean, how likely are we to see Tutuka run as optimally as possible before we even start to talk about just the energy crisis we're facing in this country?
Good afternoon, Anati. I agree with the President that we need to get all of those units at Tutuka back onto the system. But Tutuka is one of about 15 big coal-fired power stations. Each one has got 6 of those units. So that's about 90 of those units. And of those 90, only about 10 are new, the ones at the 2 new power stations. The other 80 are started being built in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s and 80s. They're old, and Eskom stated very clearly last year in its system status report that even if all of the units operate at the expected performance of such old machines, there's a power shortage of 4,000 megawatts on the grid, even if they all work. So yes, we must get all of those working, but as the President said, we need to get power onto the grid, megawatts onto the grid, and to have sufficient to avoid the risk of load shedding when those machines break down because they're old, or when they have to be taken off the system to have maintenance because they're old. To get sufficient power onto the grid, we need new generating capacity. And to get new generating capacity, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy has to implement the current plan that it has for that new generating capacity. And unfortunately, since 2015, no new contracts have been signed according to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy's own plans. That is why we have that shortage of 4,000 megawatts. We can't wish it away. We have to implement new generating capacity. The National Planning Commission this week made a statement about this, saying how to do it and that it can be done. The National Business Initiative similarly has made statements, as have a number of independent consultants, as has important civil society organizations. So yes, we need to run the old coal-fired power stations as well as we can, but they're at the end of their lives, most of them, and the two new ones, unfortunately, owing to some reported corruption in their initial contracting, reported in the United States, big fines have been paid owing to that. They too, even though they're new, they're not performing to standard. There are big problems with them. So we need other new generation capacity ASAP. We have to acknowledge that. The president has to acknowledge that. We can't just pretend that it's an Eskom problem and that it's only a corruption problem. It's also a problem of getting new generation, and that is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy's legislative responsibility. Nobody else can do it apart from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy through a legislative and regulatory process.
And one hopes that, this big announcement that we've been told to expect, about plans to boost the power supply will be speaking to that, in terms of, just getting and implementing new generation capacity. But Hilton, President Cyril Ramaphosa said yesterday that they are considering forming a second state-owned power entity or power utility to challenge Eskom's monopoly in the country. What do you make of that? And can we trust that process to be corruption-free? And will that finally solve the country's energy crisis?
So, Naiti, I read about that statement made by, and now I won't call him the president of the country, because he made that statement in his capacity as the president of the ANC at a South African Communist Party conference. And it is the stated policy, economic policy of the Communist Party to be anti-IPP. Now, what that means is anti-independent power producer. All of the plans to put new generation capacity at the moment onto the grid involve IPPs. The NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, went to court 2 years ago to challenge IPPs being put onto the grid. It is against the economic policy of the Communist Party and of important labor unions. And so if we understand the president speaking in his capacity as the president of ANC to one of the alliance partners, it's understandable that he would make a statement that essentially talks about the government building power stations, etc., and a company. And I read a bit about that. Apparently, it's reported that he compared South Africa to China and said we should look at other countries and in designing our power sector. Now, the constitution and the legislative setup and the politics of China and the laws regulating business and SOEs, comparing China and South Africa, the countries couldn't be more different, firstly. So I don't know why he chose China. Also, if you look at China, it's got 25 times the population of South Africa. Its top 5 cities are the whole population of South Africa. You've seen those big pictures of Beijing and Taipei, etc. So I think it's a bad comparison. Each of their many provinces has got a power company that's bigger than Eskom. And what they're talking about there are those power companies trading with each other, not setting up multiple power companies in each province. So I think it's a bad comparison. Secondly, it's reported that in the newspaper that the Minister of Minerals and Energy suggested this to the president of the ANC. I don't know if they were operating in their official capacities in government or if it's a party political thing. But it comes from, as far as coming from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, this comes completely out of left field. There's been no mention of this before. The DMRE has got a budget of 10 billion rand per annum to carry out this kind of planning and work, etc. And I think in the context of this power shortage, this kind of suggestion, it confuses matters. The DMRE should be implementing the policy that's come through our democratic parliament and through our democratic structures. And if it were doing so, it would be solving the power crisis. This announcement kind of, it's from left field. There are no reports on it. There hasn't been thought through. There are no details. And comparing us with China, I'm afraid, is not enough. Also, to expect two SOEs to compete with each other. I'm not aware of this happening in any country in the world. I mean, China, the provinces compete, but not countries the size of South Africa. So from the point of view of an energy researcher and somebody that's been working in this field for 30 years, this really just comes out of left field. I think it distracts us from the real solutions that are being put on the table, both by the DMRE in terms of its own policies, but also the National Business Initiative, the National Planning Commission, and others. I don't think we should allow this kind of thing to distract us from implementing the solutions that we know should work and can work.
Another possibility that could be a distraction, but also maybe just one of the things that are added on in terms of the pressure that Eskom has, is the environmental question. You know, as we know, the South African energy supply dominated by the coal, which made up 65% of the primary energy supply in 2018. Now, that's followed by crude oil with 18% or so and renewables with 11%. But are there any harmful environmental impacts that also should be of discussion as we start to look at these solutions of this energy crisis?
So the current the current policy, official policy of the government, of the DMRE, is to build large amounts of wind and photovoltaic solar power. And I was actually asked this the other day. And what I replied was, actually the interviewer, said, no matter what, nothing. You can't do anything without some impact on the environment. So I went and had a look at photovoltaics, for example. And yes, anything you do, breathing causes carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. If you die and you are buried, you will give off methane when you decompose, which is a greenhouse gas. You can't live, you can't die without some impact on the environment. So it's a matter of comparing the alternatives. And comparing photovoltaic solar, I didn't look at the wind, but the other day, it has there are many impacts. Most of it's from the manufacture of the PV cells and the frames, and the electronics, the copper, etc., that goes with it. But if you take the total environmental impact of solar photovoltaics, it's 1/50th at the moment of coal-fired power. So yes, there's a negative impact, but it's 1/50th. And if we want electricity, there will be some negative impact. And then the advanced economies are working on what's called a circular economy. And even that 1/50th impact can be substantially reduced by very careful extraction of the materials such as copper and silicon and aluminium, etc., that are needed for these cells. But then recycling them. And one can achieve recycling rates nearly of 100% if one manages this carefully. And this is what's being done. So yes, there are negative impacts. There are other impacts. For example, these big solar fields, or farms they're called. If you cut down a forest to put one of those solar farms up, yes, there's a big negative impact. But if you put them in a desert, there's a smaller impact. And if you do it carefully, there's a minimal impact given the sizes of open spaces that we have, and if it's done carefully. Similarly, these things are being put now on existing pieces of water. They're floating, once again, very minimal impact. And then, of course, they're all the empty roofs and the new roofs to be built, where we can put solar photovoltaics. So that's one example of possibly the biggest and most promising technology. So yes, they're negative effects, but they're much smaller than the alternatives, all of the alternatives, the existing mainstream gas, nuclear, coal, etc. And in future, they'll be even lower, those impacts.
Hilton Trollip is an independent consultant in the energy research sector. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Hilton.